Last night, the American president wrote on social media that a deal with Iran was imminent. The Strait of Hormuz would be reopened. The details were reportedly being finalized. The foreign minister confirmed to journalists in New Delhi that significant progress had been achieved. On the same day, Tehran responded briefly and precisely. There was no coordinated agreement, no signed documents. The fundamental positions of both sides had not changed, and they added a phrase that now echoes through the Iranian public sphere like a mantra. What you could not obtain at the negotiating table, you also failed to obtain on the battlefield. Two narratives about the same issue, and in the gap between them lies the real story. I want to begin with the question that seems most important to me right now. Who exactly does not need this deal, and who has done everything possible to prevent it from happening? Because what is taking place now is not merely a diplomatic deadlock between the United States and Iran. It is the story of how a third party spent 3 months steering both major powers exactly where it needed them to go, and how this third party is now panicking because the path out of the war chosen by Trump is destroying the entire structure it had built. That third party is Israel. I will begin with what we know about the content of the announced deal, because it is important to understand what is actually at stake before discussing whether it will materialize or not. According to leaks from American sources, especially through a Fox News correspondent, the approximate parameters are already known. American military forces in the region will remain in place for 30 days. This is not a troop withdrawal, it is a pause. Some sanctions against Iran will be lifted. Part of the frozen Iranian assets will be released. The discussion involves billions of dollars. The Strait of Hormuz will, according to the American version, be fully reopened without restrictions, essentially returning to the situation before the war began. And here lies the first decisive fracture. According to the Iranian version, presented through Iranian state media, the Strait of Hormuz will be reopened, but not unconditionally. It will operate under the framework established jointly by Iran and Oman, including ship registration, an authorization system, and fees that the Iranian side describes as environmental and security charges. In other words, precisely within the new reality that has emerged over these past 3 months, and which Iran has no intention of reversing. This is not a minor difference in wording. These are two fundamentally different systems governing the functioning of the strait. The American side describes everything as it was before the war. The Iranian side describes everything as it is now. Under the same verbal shell of an open strait lie two completely different realities. There is also a second fracture, no less significant. During the first phase of the deal, there is not a single word about the nuclear program. This issue was postponed into conditional follow-up phases after 30 and 60 days. That means in the first phase, the American side receives a symbolic military pause, a formula regarding the open strait, and time. In exchange, Iran receives a real partial lifting of sanctions, an actual release of assets, and formal recognition of the status quo in the strait. This is a very strange composition for an agreement being presented as a major diplomatic victory. In essence, it means that the American side has frozen its current situation and purchased a 30-day window, nothing more. Last night, at the exact moment when Donald Trump announced an impending agreement, the Israeli Air Force carried out strikes on Lebanon. Without an official explanation, without public justification, simply strikes carried out precisely while its ally was announcing a diplomatic breakthrough. In diplomacy, this is called a warning shot. When one side wants to demonstrate that an agreement another side is moving toward is unacceptable to it, it conducts a limited military operation. Formally, nothing is torn apart, but tension is created that cannot be ignored. A signal without words. We are here. We do not agree. Draw your own conclusions. The Israeli leadership does not want this deal. That is not speculation. It is a public position. The Prime Minister stated that the American president personally promised him the destruction of the Iranian nuclear program. A deal whose first phase does not even address the nuclear issue is, for Tel Aviv, not merely a disappointment, it represents the betrayal of a promise. But here, it is important to understand something deeper. Israel is not only against the deal. Israel was, from the beginning, the architect of this war and is now watching its architecture collapse. Let us remember February. Several days before the war began, the Western press actively reported deep disagreements between Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. Trump was supposedly restraining Israeli impulses. The war therefore appeared unlikely. A few days later, the war began in full coordination between both sides. That narrative about disagreements turned out to be an information cover, political theater. And now, once again, the same performance appears in Western media. Telephone disputes, tense conversations, and claims that Trump is supposedly pressuring Netanyahu. In my observation, this material should be approached with the same skepticism that proved justified in February. An experienced observer calls this phenomenon WrestleMania, referencing American staged wrestling, where opponents loudly argue in public, threaten terrible consequences, and behind the scenes coordinate every move according to a pre-written script. Real fractures between allies are not announced on television. They emerge quietly and become visible through consequences, not statements. But here lies the paradox of the current situation. Even if this is once again theater, this time it has a real foundation beneath it, because the war did not proceed according to plan. Iran did not collapse. The Iranian army did not disintegrate. Control over Hormuz was established. American arsenals are depleted, and Trump, a man who needs a victory for the next political cycle, is beginning to understand that continuing this war will not produce one. A bad deal at least delivers something. That is the trap in which Israel now finds itself. 3 months ago, the structure looked like this. The United States begins the war. Iran quickly collapses. Israel obtains regime change in Tehran. The entire region is rebuilt under a new architecture. The Israeli leadership expected exactly that, convinced Washington of it, and promised everything would happen quickly. None of it occurred. And now, Israel finds itself in a worse position than before. Iran has not merely survived, it has strengthened its position. It controls Hormuz. Its army is stronger than before. Its society is united around the image of victorious resistance. And the American ally is exhausted, has consumed resources, and wants to exit. That is precisely why American media over the last 48 hours began circulating reports about an alleged Iranian assassination plot targeting the daughter of the American president. Whether this information is confirmed or not is another question, but the mere fact that such reports are appearing precisely now, at the moment when an impending agreement is being announced, is itself a symptom. Someone desperately wants to prevent Trump from leaving the war. Someone has an interest in escalating emotions. It is not difficult to guess who that might be. Meanwhile, a separate crisis is growing inside Israel itself, one that Netanyahu cannot ignore. The conscription law threatens to destroy the governing coalition. The army is overstretched in every direction simultaneously. Military command is telling Benjamin Netanyahu directly, the current pace cannot be sustained indefinitely. Morale is declining, discipline is deteriorating. Israeli publications, including Hebrew-language outlets, are openly writing what until recently would have sounded like heresy. Netanyahu needs a major war as a tool to redirect domestic pressure toward an external threat and to make elections unnecessary or impossible. Within the American political system, the deal is also being rejected, and loudly rejected. Those who spent 25 years working toward a war against Iran perceive the announcement of an agreement as capitulation. Influential senators, a former Secretary of State, leading media figures, all publicly opposed it within the last 24 hours. The main accusation is this: the deal is worse than the one made by Barack Obama. This phrase was selected carefully and deliberately. For the president, within his political world, it is unbearable to hear a comparison with his Democratic predecessor that does not favor him. Every time such a comparison appears, it strikes precisely where intended. The president himself knows this, and his critics on the right know that he knows it. That is why the phrase "worse than Obama" is repeated day after day across the airwaves until the deal either collapses or is rewritten in a harsher direction. And here lies a situation with no good exit. Signing the deal in its current form means hearing the word Obama millions of times and losing part of his own political base. Refusing to sign means admitting that 3 months of war achieved nothing and leaving the country trapped in the current stalemate, which becomes economically more expensive every week. Meanwhile, military figures within the American system are largely in favor of the deal for understandable reasons. They know that the second phase of the war would be worse than the first. They know they lack the resources to fight it. They know Iran has developed capabilities over these months that it did not possess in February. The military establishment needs some form of agreement to escape this deadlock. Donald Trump now stands caught between two factions within his own camp, between the neoconservatives and his own military commanders. Now to what is happening on the other side, because inside Iran the picture is no less interesting, and it is barely reflected in the Western press. The Iranian president, whom Western media usually describe as a pragmatist and reformer, made a public statement this week in favor of negotiations, referring to historical religious figures, to the necessity of avoiding further sacrifices, and to the possibility of a peaceful solution. This is the voice of the part of the Iranian elite that is prepared for compromise. At the same time, a general from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard issued a public statement invoking the same historical religious figures mentioned by the president, but with the opposite meaning. We will not allow a painful historical experience to repeat itself. In other words, we will not allow ourselves to be deceived as happened with previous agreements. These are two public voices inside the Iranian system, speaking differently about the same situation. And here it is important to understand one thing. Decisions within the Iranian system are not made by the president. Decisions are made by another structure, and it is precisely its voice that is heard through the general of the Revolutionary Guard. The president will not be the final negotiator. That means even if the American side reaches an agreement with the president, that still does not constitute a final agreement. The Iranian formula about what you failed to obtain on the battlefield represents the public position of the part of the Iranian power structure that holds the real levers of authority. And that position is simple. Nothing can be surrendered at the negotiating table for which 3 months of war were fought. Control over the strait? No. The uranium? No. Recognition of Iran's regional position? No. And there is another factor that the Western press barely discusses, yet in Iran it is remembered daily. That is the assassination of the Iranian leader in February. Not only his assassination, but the killing of his wife, his daughter-in-law, and his granddaughter as well. An entire family was wiped out in a single strike. For Iranian society, this is not an abstraction. These are concrete names, concrete funerals, and a concrete sense of injustice that cannot be erased through sanctions relief. When Western commentators discuss pragmatic concessions the Iranian side should make for the sake of the economy, they fail to understand that within Iranian public consciousness, after the events of February, every such concession appears equivalent to betraying the memory of those who were killed. This is the foundation upon which the position of the Revolutionary Guard stands. Not geopolitical calculation, but something much simpler. We do not surrender at the table what such a high price was paid for. To understand why the sides are even discussing a deal at this moment, one must examine the condition of the American military system. Because what has emerged in recent weeks is not merely a tactical problem, it is a structural crisis. According to the Washington Post, the United States still has around 200 THAAD interceptor missiles remaining in the region. Half of the original stockpile was consumed during 37 days of active combat operations. Each interceptor missile costs approximately $700,000. This is not a minor accounting detail. These are public figures that indicate one simple reality. The American war machine in its current form is not designed for a prolonged war against an opponent capable of producing missiles faster than the United States can intercept them. And this arithmetic represents the fundamental problem of the entire current American military strategy. One interceptor missile costs millions of dollars. An Iranian drone costs a few thousand. An Iranian missile only tens of thousands. To destroy an Iranian target worth $30,000, the American side spends $12 million. That is a ratio of roughly 1 to 400. No economy, regardless of how powerful it may be, can sustain such a ratio for long. And there is another detail that extends beyond Iran itself. This year, the military budget of the United States exceeded $1.5 trillion, including supplemental requests. That is a historic record. At the same time, the Secretary of Defense appears in video addresses promising to optimize spending, reduce waste, and restore order. The contrast between the public rhetoric of austerity and the actual doubling of the military budget is so obvious that further comment becomes unnecessary. History contains enough examples showing how such structures usually end. Financial bubbles typically destroy economies and lead to recessions. Defense bubbles function differently. They destroy regimes because they are always tied to some military adventure that promises rapid success and ends in an uncontrollable crisis. Here it is worth mentioning a historical parallel that explains much. At the height of its power, the British Empire was simultaneously engaged in around 40 different conflicts across various parts of the world. That was not a conscious choice, but the consequence of imperial logic itself. An empire must be present everywhere, guarantee everything, react to everything. And precisely this interconnectedness, which once represented the empire's strength, became its greatest weakness. Too many obligations, too many fronts, too many places where defeat is unacceptable, because otherwise everything else begins to shake. The same thing is now happening with the American system. Iran is not the only crisis. Simultaneously, there is the Ukrainian front. Simultaneously, the Taiwan issue, where this aid package has already been suspended several times. Simultaneously, Venezuela, Cuba, Latin America. Simultaneously, the economic confrontation with China. And the American system is trying to hold everything together at once, just as the British Empire attempted to sustain 40 conflicts a century earlier, with the same result. Now, to what astonishes me most in this situation, the current American president has already had 3 opportunities to sign an advantageous agreement with Iran, and each time he refused. The first time was the 2015 agreement, known as the nuclear deal. Strict, equipped with built-in control mechanisms, with inspectors on the ground, with enrichment restrictions. By every formal parameter, an agreement that guaranteed the absence of Iranian nuclear weapons as far as anything can ever truly be guaranteed in international politics. 3 years after signing it, the current president of the United States withdrew from the agreement. He declared that he wanted a better one. He never got a better one. The second time was February 26th of this year, 2 days before the war began. Through Omani mediation, a new agreement had been arranged, by many parameters better than the 2015 agreement. The Iranian side was ready. The document was already in the hands of Donald Trump. He could have signed it and proclaimed a major diplomatic victory. He did not sign it. 2 days later, the war began. The third time is now, after 3 months of war, after the assassination of the Iranian leader together with his family, after the sinking of dozens of Iranian ships, after the destruction of a significant portion of Iranian infrastructure. After all this, the American side is attempting to obtain conditions that had been available freely on the table in February, and it is not receiving them. Instead, it is receiving something substantially worse. This is not the coincidence of a single decision, it is a pattern. The American state management system, in its current form, is structurally incapable of concluding advantageous diplomatic agreements, incapable of recognizing that its position today is weaker than yesterday, incapable of resolving issues through compromise. And here lies the most important analytical point. This inability is not a personal characteristic of one president. It is the manifestation of a deeper structural problem. Parallel to the Iran crisis, another negotiation process continued for a year and a half without visible results. I am speaking about the Ukrainian one. The same American envoys, including Witkoff and Kushner, traveled to Moscow, held lengthy discussions, and repeatedly announced imminent progress. A year and a half ago, a year ago, 6 months ago. The progress never materialized. The conflict continues. No agreement that the American side could present to voters was ever achieved. The connection between these two situations is not accidental. Both were handled by the same state apparatus, using the same methods and the same instruments, and both proved impossible to conclude. Not because one side was unconstructive, but because the American system in its current form has forgotten how to conduct serious multilateral negotiations. For a serious deal between major powers to function, guarantors are required. Third parties that ensure the agreement will be respected. If one does not trust the negotiating partner, someone trusted by both sides is necessary. In the classical diplomacy of the 20th century, the major powers fulfilled this role for one another. Now, without guarantors at the level of major global actors, no agreement survives. It may be signed and announced, and a week later one side violates it while nobody possesses the ability to enforce compliance. And this is the second layer of the problem. The American side is not only incapable of reaching an agreement itself, it also lacks a framework within which such an agreement could be institutionalized without the participation of other major centers of global power. And those powers were not invited into the current negotiating configuration concerning Iran at all. Any agreement will survive only until one of the parties finds a reason to withdraw. At the same time, the aircraft carrier Nimitz was redeployed to the Caribbean toward Cuba without any understandable military explanation. When a superpower cannot achieve victory on the main front, it begins searching for a less protected opponent in order to demonstrate symbolic strength. Cuba fits that role perfectly: small, isolated, economically exhausted, without serious military capabilities. Threatening Cuba can be done without consequences. This is the behavior of a late-stage empire. When things become difficult, attention shifts toward easier targets. And when even the easy targets are insufficient, the system turns toward symbolic gestures. At a certain stage, this becomes the only remaining method for preserving the illusion of greatness, before itself, before voters, before allies. What I consider the most probable scenario over the coming days is this. The deal announced yesterday is unlikely to be implemented in its current form. Too many vectors of pressure are acting against it simultaneously within the American system. The neoconservative wing is shouting capitulation. Within the Iranian system, the Revolutionary Guard speaks about repeating a painful historical experience. From outside, Israel demonstrates through attacks on Lebanon that it does not accept this agreement. The state apparatus that should have coordinated all of this is structurally incapable of solving such tasks. What happens next? Several possibilities exist. The most probable is that the deal will be rewritten multiple times in an attempt to satisfy all sides, and afterward either collapse or transform into something symbolic without real substance. It would provide the American president with the opportunity to proclaim a conditional victory, the Iranian side with the opportunity to preserve the status quo, and the Israeli side with the opportunity to continue its own course. Everyone would have something to present to their voters, yet the real situation would remain unchanged. The second possibility is that the deal collapses entirely, and within weeks, the war scenario returns, with Yemen and Iraq fully involved, along with the regional economic consequences I discussed in earlier analyses. This scenario is possible, especially if the Israeli side decides that the current position of the American president does not suit its interests and takes actions designed to destroy every compromise. The third possibility is the slowest, but perhaps the most realistic. No deal, no war. Simply a suspended condition in which the sides quietly drift apart, each moving in its own direction. The American side quietly reduces its military presence. The Iranian side quietly normalizes its regime in the Strait. Everyone gradually stops making public statements. After several months, it becomes clear that the war ended without a formal conclusion, and that the Strait now simply functions as it functions. This is defeat disguised as the absence of an event. An old diplomatic trick. It is called walking away while pretending not to walk away. At the same time, one must understand an important detail that is often lost in public discussions about deals and negotiations. Even if tomorrow a complete agreement is announced and all sides sign it, the global economic situation will not immediately normalize. Oil flows disrupted by 3 months of crisis do not recover at the push of a button. That process takes months. Strategic reserves consumed throughout the crisis must somehow be replenished. Logistics chains rebuilt around new routes do not instantly revert to their previous form. Investor confidence in the region, once shaken, takes even longer to recover. Therefore, even the most successful scenario involving a signed deal does not represent a return to the situation before February 28th. It represents a new reality in which the Iranian side has strengthened its position, the American side has weakened, and the global economy enters a recessionary phase that is unavoidable in the foreseeable future. A deal may soften that recession, may delay it over time, but cannot prevent it. Which of the three scenarios will ultimately materialize, nobody knows for certain right now. But the common conclusion across all three remains the same. Every week under the current conditions costs the American economy more than the Iranian one. Time in this situation is not working in favor of the American side, and therefore, whatever path out Washington chooses, there will be no victorious ending. If you found this analysis useful, support the video with a comment and a like. Until next time. Our team translated this material specifically for the German-speaking audience in order to convey these ideas as precisely and clearly as possible. If anything raised questions, we look forward to your comments.